The Galactic Youth Combat Championships had seen some spectacular failures in its 3-century history. There was the year the Zephyrian delegation accidentally brought their elderly philosophers instead of their warriors, a mix-up that resulted in the most boring tournament ever recorded. Then there was the infamous incident when the crystalline Luxons shattered mid-fight because nobody told them the arena had a sound system. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, compared to the cosmic embarrassment that was the Velnari Cubs. Picture, if you will, the most naturally gifted predators in known space. Sleek, feline humanoids with reflexes that made hummingbirds look sluggish, claws that could slice through titanium, and pack-hunting instincts refined over millions of years of evolution. Now, picture them losing to a team of geriatric blob creatures who moved like they were swimming through molasses. Pathetic. Coach Mordak's forearms gestured wildly as he watched his cubs get systematically dismantled by opponents who shouldn't have been able to touch them. The insectoid's compound eyes reflected the arena lights as he chittered in frustration. They have everything: speed, strength, killer instincts, and yet they fight like sedated house pets. In the arena below, Ket, the lead cub, dodged a blow so slowly that even the crowd winced. His opponent, a gelatinous quarian whose top speed was roughly equivalent to a leisurely stroll, managed to land a hit that sent the Velnari tumbling across the combat floor. The audience, a mixture of species from across the galaxy, erupted in what could generously be called laughter, and less generously be called the sound of an entire stadium losing faith in natural selection. Nox, the largest of the cubs, attempted what should have been a devastating charge. Instead, he ran straight into a force barrier that had been clearly visible for the past 30 seconds. His teammate Lyra, whose analytical mind should have made her a tactical genius, stood frozen in place like she was trying to solve a particularly difficult math problem, while her opponent casually walked up and tapped her shoulder for the elimination. Commissioner Thal X, the tournament's chief administrator, watched from his executive box with the kind of expression typically reserved for witnessing traffic accidents. His reptilian features were locked in a permanent grimace as he contemplated the paperwork this disaster would generate. The Velnari had been guaranteed a spot in the championships based on their species' legendary combat prowess. Instead, they'd managed to lose to teams that other teams used for warm-up practice. 68 consecutive defeats, Thalex muttered, consulting his holographic display. That has to be some kind of record. "Oh, it is," replied his assistant, a multi-limbed creature whose species had evolved specifically to handle bureaucracy. "They've broken the previous record for futility by a factor of B3. The betting pools have stopped taking wagers against them. It's considered poor sportsmanship to bet against the inevitable." Down in the arena, Zara and Bane were engaged in what the announcer charitably called combat, but what looked more like an interpretive dance about defeat. Zara's natural agility, which should have made her untouchable, somehow resulted in her tripping over her own feet. Bane's unpredictable fighting style had become so unpredictable that it surprised even him, usually in ways that involved him accidentally eliminating himself from matches. The crowd had started bringing entertainment to the Cubs' matches: books, holographic games, even knitting. One particularly entrepreneurial vendor had begun selling Velnari bingo cards, where spectators marked off squares for different types of spectacular failures. Trips over own tail was apparently the free space in the center. Coach Mordak had tried everything. He'd analyzed their combat forms. Perfect. He'd tested their physical conditioning. Exceptional. He'd brought in tactical advisors, meditation masters, even a sports psychologist who specialized in feline species. nothing worked. The cubs fought with the enthusiasm of beings who'd rather be literally anywhere else, doing literally anything else. "Perhaps," suggested the tournament's medical officer, a wise-looking creature whose species had been studying combat sports since before most civilizations had discovered fire. "The problem isn't physical. Perhaps it's something more fundamental." Fundamental? Mordak's antennae twitched with irritation. "They have all the fundamentals: speed, strength, reflexes, training." "Heart," interrupted the medical officer. "I mean heart. When did you last see a fighter succeed without passion?" Mordak was about to dismiss this as philosophical nonsense when Commissioner Thalex's assistant approached with a datapad and an expression that somehow managed to look apologetic, despite belonging to a species with no recognizable facial features. "Sir, we have a problem. The Velnari homeworld is threatening to withdraw from the Galactic Athletic Coalition entirely if their cubs don't show improvement. They're claiming we've sabotaged their fighters somehow." Thalex's tail thrashed. Never a good sign. "Sabotaged? We've given them everything they asked for. Premium training facilities, the best nutritional programs, access to the most advanced combat simulators." "Yes, sir. But they're pointing out that every other species seems to perform better than expected, while theirs performs worse. They're demanding we provide them with a coach from outside their traditional training methods." "Outside? What do they mean, outside?" The assistant consulted the datapad. "They want someone from a species that's never coached Velnari before. Someone with what they call fresh perspective." This was how Danny ended up in the most bizarre job interview of his life, sitting across from a lizard, an insect, and something that looked like it had been assembled from spare geometric shapes. The humans had only recently been admitted to the galactic community, and their participation in most interstellar activities was still considered somewhat experimental. "Let me understand this correctly," Danny said, leaning back in his chair. "You want me to coach a team of alien cat people who keep losing to opponents they should be able to defeat blindfolded?" "That is an adequate summary," Thalex replied, his forked tongue flicking out nervously. "Your species has shown remarkable adaptability in other fields. Perhaps that quality extends to athletic coaching." Danny had been coaching fighters for most of his adult life, but never ones with fur, claws, and the ability to leap 3 times their own height. He'd worked with humans who'd lost their edge, fighters who'd forgotten why they started competing in the first place. Looking at the holographic footage of the Velnari cubs, he saw something familiar in their eyes. Not incompetence, but disconnection. "What have their previous coaches focused on?" Danny asked. "Technique, conditioning, strategy, mental preparation, all the standard approaches," Mordak answered, his compound eyes reflecting his confusion about why he was discussing this with a human. "And how do you typically motivate fighters from their species?" "Motivate?" The question seemed to puzzle the insectoid. "They are Velnari. They are born motivated to fight. It is their nature." Danny nodded slowly. He'd heard this before, from coaches who'd forgotten that natural ability meant nothing without purpose. "When do I start?" The Cubs' first meeting with their new human coach went exactly as well as you might expect. They sat in a semicircle, their expressions ranging from mild curiosity to outright skepticism. Danny studied each of them, Ket, with his natural leadership bearing undermined by obvious self-doubt, Knox, whose size should have made him intimidating, but who carried himself like he was apologizing for taking up space, Lyra, whose intelligent eyes held no spark of competitive fire, Zara, whose graceful movements seemed practiced but joyless, and Bane, whose unpredictability had become a liability rather than an asset. "So," Danny said, settling into a chair that had been hastily modified for human proportions. "Anyone want to tell me why you're losing to opponents you could defeat in your sleep?" The Cubs exchanged glances. Ket, as the unofficial leader, finally spoke. "We do not understand the question. We follow all training protocols. We execute techniques as instructed. The outcomes are simply unfortunate." Unfortunate. Danny repeated the word like he was tasting something unpleasant. "Kid, losing to a team of arthritic blob creatures isn't unfortunate. It's impossible. Unless ... He paused, studying their faces. "Unless you don't actually want to win." The silence that followed was the kind that made sound engineers nervous about their equipment. Finally, Bain spoke up, his voice barely above a whisper. "Want has never been discussed in our training." And there it was. Danny had found his answer. Danny spent the next 3 days doing something that apparently no coach in the Cubs' history had bothered with. Actually watching them. Not their technique, not their form, not their adherence to training protocols, but them. How they moved when they thought nobody was looking. How they interacted with each other between sessions. How they held themselves when they walked through the corridors of the training facility. What he saw made him want to punch something, preferably the face of whatever genius had designed their previous training regimen. The Cubs moved like ghosts, haunting their own bodies. Ket carried himself with the posture of a leader who'd been told leadership was a burden rather than a privilege. Knox apologized for his presence with every step, as if being large was somehow offensive. Lyra approached every situation like a problem to be solved rather than an experience to be lived. Zara's natural grace had been refined into mechanical perfection, all the joy squeezed out like water from a sponge. And Bain, poor Bain, had been so conditioned to suppress his instincts that his unpredictability was really just confusion about what he was supposed to want. "Tell me about your species," Danny said during their second training session, ignoring the carefully prepared workout regimen Coach Mordak had left behind. "Not the technical stuff, how you actually live." The Cubs looked at him like he'd asked them to explain quantum physics using interpretive dance. "We are pack hunters," Ket offered uncertainly. "We coordinate attacks. We support each other. We—" "No, no, no." Danny waved his hand. "That's textbook stuff. I want to know what it feels like to be part of a pack. What happens when one of you is in trouble? What happens when you succeed together?" Lyra tilted her head, a gesture so unconsciously feline it made Danny smile. "Feel like? We have not been trained to analyze emotional responses to pack dynamics." Of course they hadn't. Danny had worked with plenty of fighters who'd been overtrained, but this was the first time he'd encountered a group that had been trained out of their own instincts. It was like teaching a fish to walk, and then wondering why it kept drowning. That night, Danny did something that would have gotten him fired from any respectable human gym. He researched. Not training techniques or combat theory, but the actual evolutionary history of the Velnari. What he found made the Cubs' situation even more tragic. Velnari packs in the wild didn't just hunt together. They celebrated together. Every successful hunt ended with what xenobiologists called triumph displays, elaborate social rituals that reinforced pack bonds and individual worth simultaneously. They played. They showed off for each other. They made noise, lots of noise, because success was meant to be shared. The Cubs had been trained in isolation. They'd been taught that combat was serious business, that celebration was unprofessional, that emotional displays were weakness. Someone had taken natural-born performers and turned them into mechanical executors of technique. Son of a... Danny caught himself before completing the phrase, though there was nobody around to be offended by human profanity. He was looking at the athletic equivalent of psychological abuse. The next morning, he threw out every training plan the Cubs had ever been given. "Today, we're going to do something different," Danny announced, leading them to a smaller practice area. "We're going to learn how to want something." The Cubs exchanged those looks again, the ones that said they were dealing with a possibly insane human who didn't understand the basic principles of athletic training. "Want is not a learned skill," Knox rumbled, his deep voice carrying the kind of patient confusion of someone explaining the obvious. "Want is an emotional response to stimulus." "Exactly." Danny clapped his hands together, the sharp sound making all 5 Cubs' ears twitch. "And you've been trained to ignore emotional responses. So we're going to untrain that." What followed was probably the strangest coaching session in the history of organized sports. Danny had each Cub perform their basic combat forms, not against opponents, but for the sheer joy of movement. When Zara executed a perfect spinning strike, he made her do it again, but this time asked her to notice how it felt when everything clicked into place. "It feels..." She paused, searching for words that had been systematically removed from her vocabulary. "It feels good, like my body knows exactly what to do." "That's called satisfaction," Danny told her. "Hold on to that feeling." With Ket, he focused on leadership moments, times when the natural pack leader in him emerged despite his training. When Knox landed a particularly powerful strike, Danny made him roar. Actually roar. The sound that came out was so genuinely fierce that it startled everyone, including Knox himself. "Why did you make me do that?" Knox asked, looking embarrassed. "Because that's what victory sounds like for your species," Danny replied. "And you've been trained to be ashamed of it." The breakthrough came during their 4th day together. Danny had set up a simple exercise. Cubs versus training drones. Nothing serious, just basic coordination drills. But instead of standing silently on the sidelines like every coach they'd ever had, Danny started cheering. Not human cheering. That would have been meaningless to them, but genuine enthusiasm for what they were doing right. When Lyra executed a perfect tactical maneuver, he called it out. When Bane's unpredictability actually worked in his favor, Danny made sure everyone noticed. When they moved as a coordinated unit, he celebrated it like they'd just won the championship. The change was subtle at first. Ket's shoulders straightened slightly. Zara's movements gained a fraction more fluidity. Knox stopped apologizing for his size and started using it as an advantage. Lyra began making decisions based on instinct rather than overthinking every option. And Bane started fighting like his unpredictability was a feature, not a bug. But it was still just training. The real test would come in their next tournament match, scheduled for the following week, against the Cocksmith Warriors, the insectoid species that had dominated the youth championships for the past 5 cycles. The Cocksmith fight as individuals, Coach Mordak explained during their strategy session, his compound eyes reflecting tactical calculations. They rely on superior physical conditioning and aggressive techniques. Standard approach is to match their aggression and outlast them. Danny looked at the Cubs, who were already slipping back into their mechanical training responses. "What do you think?" he asked them. "How do Velnari naturally hunt prey that's individually stronger?" Ket's eyes sharpened, the first time Danny had seen genuine tactical interest rather than rote protocol. "We coordinate. We use pack tactics. We make them fight all of us at once instead of one-on-one engagements." "But tournament rules require individual combat phases," Lyra pointed out, ever the analyst. "Do they require individual thinking?" Danny asked. Because I've read the rules, and there's nothing that says you can't coordinate strategy, communicate during matches, or support each other emotionally." The Cubs stared at him like he'd just suggested they could breathe underwater. Previous coaches have always emphasized individual focus during combat, Zara said carefully. Coordination is for team phases only. Previous coaches, Danny said, settling into his chair with a grin, never coached a pack species. They coached you like you were humans, or insects, or whatever species they knew. But you're not. You're Velnari. So let's figure out what that actually means. Over the next 3 days, Danny watched something beautiful happen. The Cubs began talking to each other, not just tactical communication, but actual conversation. They started moving differently, not as 5 individuals who happened to be in the same space, but as parts of a whole. Most importantly, they started wanting things. Ket wanted to lead, not because he'd been designated as team captain, but because guiding his pack felt natural and right. Knox wanted to use his strength to protect his teammates, not just to win matches. Lyra wanted to solve the puzzle of their opponent's weaknesses, not just execute predetermined strategies. Zara wanted to dance, because that's what her combat style really was. A deadly ballet that had been coached out of her. And Bane wanted to surprise everyone, including himself, because unpredictability was his gift, not his flaw. The night before their match against the Cocksmith, Danny found the Cubs in their common area, actually playing together for the first time since he'd known them. They were engaged in some sort of Velnari game that involved complex movements and a lot of good-natured growling. They looked, for the first time, like what they were. Young beings who happened to be incredibly gifted athletes, not athletes who happened to be young beings. "Coach Danny," Ket approached him with something Danny had never seen before in his posture: confidence. "We have been discussing tomorrow's match." "Oh, we think we know how to beat the Cocksmith." Ket's ears were forward, alert and eager. "But we need to know. Will you be cheering for us?" The question was asked so seriously, with such genuine need, that Danny felt something twist in his chest. These Cubs had been trained by beings who saw emotional support as weakness, who treated encouragement like a crutch instead of fuel. "Kid," Danny said, grinning despite the sudden tightness in his throat, "I'm going to cheer so loud they'll hear me on your home world." The Cubs exchanged looks, not the uncertain glances he'd grown used to, but the kind of communication that passed between pack members who trusted each other completely. "Good," Ket said simply. "We think that might be the piece we have been missing." Danny was about to find out just how right they were. The arena buzzed with the kind of anticipation typically reserved for watching natural disasters unfold in real time. Word had spread throughout the galactic sports community that the Velnari Cubs, the same team that had managed to lose to a group of elderly philosophers who'd wandered onto the wrong transport, were facing the Cocksmith Warriors. The betting pools had reopened, but only to take wagers on how quickly the Cubs would lose and whether any of them would manage to land a single blow. Danny stood in the coaching area, watching the warm-ups with the kind of nervous energy he hadn't felt since his first professional bout. The Cocksmith Warriors moved like killing machines, which, evolutionarily speaking, they were. 6-limbed insectoids with exoskeletons that could deflect most conventional weapons, they fought with the cold efficiency of beings who viewed combat as a mathematical equation with only one correct answer. Hive Commander Skal, their leader, stood nearly 8 feet tall and possessed the kind of predatory focus that made other species instinctively step backward. Warrior Neth moved with surgical precision, every gesture calculated for maximum efficiency. Drone Prime Gox was built like a living tank, his reinforced carapace scarred from countless victories. The cubs looked different, not dramatically. They still had the same sleek builds, the same natural grace, the same physical capabilities they'd always possessed. But something in their posture had changed. They moved like they belonged in their own bodies again. Ket stood at the center of his pack, not because protocol demanded it, but because leadership flowed from him naturally. Nox had stopped hunching his shoulders, finally comfortable with taking up the space his size required. Lyra's analytical mind was focused outward instead of inward, studying their opponents with genuine tactical curiosity rather than fearful calculation. Zara stretched with fluid motions that looked more like dance than calisthenics. And Bane was practically vibrating with contained energy, like a spring wound too tight. "The Velnari Cubs have a new coaching approach," the arena announcer proclaimed, his voice echoing off the walls. "For the first time in tournament history, they've brought in a human trainer. Whether this represents innovation or desperation remains to be seen." Commissioner Thalex observed from his executive box, his reptilian features carefully neutral. Beside him, various dignitaries from across the galaxy settled in to watch what most expected to be a mercifully brief slaughter. The Velnari homeworld's representative sat forward in his seat, his own feline features tense with what looked like hope, mixed with impending embarrassment. The first phase began with individual combat, each team selecting champions for single elimination rounds. Standard Velnari protocol would have been to send their technically best fighter. Instead, Danny watched Ket gesture to his pack, actually consulting them like their opinions mattered. "We send Zara first," Ket announced, his decision carrying the weight of genuine leadership rather than arbitrary authority. Zara stepped into the combat circle, facing Warrior Neth. The insectoid's compound eyes tracked every micro-movement, calculating angles and probabilities. Previous Velnari fighters would have opened with textbook techniques, following predetermined patterns that their opponents could easily counter. Zara began to dance. Not literally. This was still a combat sport. But her movement flowed with a fluidity that made watching her feel like witnessing poetry in motion. Every strike connected smoothly to the next, every dodge flowing into a counterattack. She wasn't following a fighting form, she was improvising, letting her body express itself the way it had evolved to move. Warrior Neth, programmed for efficiency, found herself fighting an opponent who made no mathematical sense. Zara's attacks came from unexpected angles, flowed into combinations that defied tactical logic, and somehow managed to find gaps in Neth's defense that shouldn't have existed. The crowd, prepared for another embarrassing Velnari defeat, gradually fell silent. This wasn't the mechanical combat they'd grown accustomed to seeing from the Cubs. This was art. "Come on, Zara." Danny's voice cut through the arena noise like a blade through silk. "Show them what a real hunter looks like." The effect was immediate and electric. Zara's ears perked up at the genuine enthusiasm in her coach's voice, and something shifted in her expression. The careful control she'd maintained throughout the match gave way to something wilder, more primal. She wasn't just fighting anymore. She was hunting. Warrior Neth managed exactly 3 more defensive moves before Zara's claws found their mark, delivering a strike that sent the insectoid tumbling across the combat floor. The crowd erupted, not in laughter this time, but in genuine amazement. "Winner! Zara of the Velnari!" The announcer's voice cracked slightly with surprise. The Cubs' celebration was nothing like the subdued acknowledgments they'd been trained to give. Ket let out a roar of triumph, that made half the arena's occupants instinctively check their exits. Nox pounded the barrier with enthusiasm that would have been embarrassing in their previous mindset, but now felt perfectly natural. Bane did some sort of acrobatic flip that served no tactical purpose except expressing pure joy. And Danny grinned like he'd just watched his own daughter take her first steps. Hive Commander Skal observed this display with the kind of cold calculation his species had perfected over millennia. Emotional responses were weaknesses to be exploited, not strengths to be celebrated. He selected his next fighter accordingly. Drone Prime Gox will face their largest fighter, Skal declared. Brute force against brute force. Nox stepped into the circle, and for the first time in his competitive career, he didn't apologize for his presence. He stood at his full height, shoulders square, looking every inch the apex predator his genetics had designed him to be. Drone Prime Gox was a living siege engine built for overwhelming offensive power. His opening charge would have flattened most opponents, turning combat into a simple question of physics. Nox caught him. Not deflected, not dodged, caught. The massive Velnari absorbed the impact, his claws finding purchase on Gox's carapace, and suddenly the brute force equation had two variables instead of one. "That's it, big guy?" Danny's encouragement rang across the arena. "Show them what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object." What happened was that the immovable object decided to move anyway. Nox lifted Drone Prime Gox, all 800 pounds of armored insectoid, over his head, and held him there for a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. The crowd held its collective breath. Then Nox brought his opponent down in a controlled throw that managed to be both devastating and oddly gentle, ending the match without causing permanent injury. The arena exploded. Species that had been making jokes about the Velnari cubs 5 minutes earlier were now on their feet, cheering for beings they'd written off as cosmic jokes. 2 wins! The cubs had managed 2 consecutive victories against opponents who should have annihilated them. Hive Commander Skal's compound eyes reflected something that might have been concern. This was not proceeding according to any tactical model his species understood. Emotional responses were supposed to be chaotic, unpredictable weaknesses. They weren't supposed to make fighters better. The third match pitted Lyra against Skal himself. Analytical mind against hive intelligence. Individual creativity against collective calculation. Skal fought like a computer program made flesh. Every move optimized for efficiency. Every strategy calculated for maximum probability of success. He was, by any reasonable measure, the superior fighter. Lyra fought like someone who'd finally been given permission to think. Her analytical nature, previously turned inward in endless self-doubt, now focused outward with laser precision. She read Skal's patterns, anticipated his strategies, and began doing something that made Danny's coaching heart sing. She started adapting in real time. When Skal shifted to aggressive offense, Lyra became untouchable, flowing around his attacks like water around stone. When he pulled back to defensive positioning, she pressed forward with strikes that found weaknesses in his guard that he didn't know existed. She wasn't just fighting. She was solving the puzzle of how to defeat someone who should have been unbeatable. "Think, Lyra," Danny called out. "You're smarter than any hive mind. Use that brain." Skal made his fatal error in the final exchange. Faced with an opponent who refused to follow predictable patterns, he fell back on brute force tactics, abandoning the subtle strategies that made him dangerous. Lyra was waiting for exactly that mistake. Her finishing move was so elegant in its simplicity that combat analysts would study it for years afterward. A simple redirect of Scal's momentum, combined with leverage applied at precisely the right angle, sent the Hive commander tumbling out of bounds with his dignity barely intact. 3 wins, 3 consecutive victories against the defending champions. The crowd was in full roar now, but Danny barely heard them. He was watching his cubs, seeing them experience something they'd never been allowed to feel before. The pure, intoxicating rush of success earned through their own choices, their own instincts, their own passion. Ket and Bane still had matches to fight, but something had fundamentally changed in the arena's atmosphere. The Cocksmith warriors, previously confident in their superiority, now looked at their remaining opponents with something approaching wariness. The cubs looked at each other with something approaching wonder. But the real transformation was yet to come. The 4th match would be Ket's moment, leader against leader, natural authority against Hive command structure. The Cocksmith sent out their reserve commander, a scarred veteran named Crix, who'd never lost an individual combat in his entire career. Ket entered the circle with something his previous coaches would have found terrifying: complete confidence in his own instincts. Not arrogance, not manufactured bravado, but the quiet certainty of a natural leader who'd finally been given permission to lead. Crix opened with the kind of brutal efficiency his species was famous for. His movements were economical, deadly, and utterly predictable to anyone who'd bothered to study Cocksmith combat doctrine. Previous Velnari fighters would have tried to match this efficiency, turning the fight into a technical exercise. Ket did something unprecedented. He started talking. "You fight well," he called out between exchanges, his voice carrying easily across the combat circle. "But do you know why you fight?" Crix's compound eyes reflected confusion. Psychological warfare wasn't part of standard Cocksmith tactics. Combat was about physical dominance, not mental games. "I fight to win," Crix replied, launching another precisely calculated attack sequence. "I fight for them," Ket responded, gesturing briefly toward his packmates. His movement flowed seamlessly into a counterattack that caught Crix completely off guard. Danny watched from the sidelines, recognizing something beautiful happening. Ket wasn't just fighting as an individual, he was fighting as the heart of his pack, drawing strength from connection rather than isolation. "That's it, Ket," Danny shouted, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet arena. "Show him what leadership really looks like." The effect on Ket was immediate and profound. Every lesson about pack dynamics, every instinct about protecting and guiding his team, crystallized into pure combat effectiveness. He moved like flowing water, striking like lightning, and defended with the implacable strength of someone who had others depending on him. Crix, trained in individual combat excellence, found himself facing an opponent who drew power from sources his species didn't understand. Every time the insectoid pressed an advantage, Ket's awareness of his watching packmates seemed to fuel new reserves of strength and creativity. The end came suddenly. Crix attempted his signature finishing move, a complex aerial strike that had ended dozens of careers. Ket caught him mid-leap with a technique that was part martial art, part pack hunting instinct, and entirely devastating. The insectoid hit the ground with the kind of finality that ended arguments. The arena fell silent for a heartbeat. Then, the explosion of noise that followed made the previous celebrations sound like whispered conversations. 4 wins, 4 consecutive victories against opponents who dominated the tournament circuit for cycles. But it was the 5th and final individual match that would become legend. Bane stepped into the circle to face the last Cocksmith fighter, a young warrior named Vex, who'd been brought specifically to counter unpredictable opponents. The insectoid's entire training regimen had focused on adaptability, on reading and responding to chaos. What Vex hadn't prepared for was an opponent who'd finally embraced chaos as an art form. Bane moved like liquid madness, flowing between fighting styles with no apparent pattern or logic. One moment he fought like a classical duelist, the next like a street brawler, then suddenly shifted to techniques that seemed entirely improvised. Vex's adaptive training, designed to find patterns in chaos, found nothing to adapt to. "Let it flow, Bane." Danny's encouragement rang across the arena. "Show them that unpredictable doesn't mean unfocused." And that's when the true magic happened. Bane's chaotic fighting style suddenly revealed its underlying structure. Not randomness, but infinite possibility channeled through perfect instinct. He wasn't fighting without pattern. He was creating new patterns faster than his opponent could process them. Vex, overwhelmed by an approach that defied every tactical theory his species had developed, made the critical error of hesitation. In that moment of uncertainty, Bane struck with a combination so fluid and creative, it looked like it was being invented in real time. 5 wins. A complete sweep of individual combat against the defending champions. The Cubs erupted in celebration that was part victory roar, part pack bonding ritual, and entirely magnificent to witness. They moved as one unit, supporting each other, sharing the triumph as a collective achievement rather than individual victories. They were winning, not through luck, not through their opponent's mistakes, but through their own rediscovered excellence. They were remembering what they were born to be. And Danny was already planning how to help them become even better. The tournament was far from over, but something told him the galaxy was about to learn a very important lesson about what happened when you gave natural-born champions permission to actually want something. The Cocksmith were about to discover that mathematical precision was no match for passion unleashed, and every other species in the arena was beginning to suspect that maybe, just maybe, they'd been underestimating both the Velnari Cubs and their strange human coach. The championship finals arrived with the pomp and circumstance typically reserved for crowning emperors or launching new solar systems. The arena had been expanded to accommodate the largest audience in tournament history. Beings from every corner of the galaxy had arrived to witness what sports commentators were calling the most improbable comeback in competitive combat history. The Velnari Cubs, no longer the cosmic punchline they'd been mere weeks ago, now carried themselves with the quiet confidence of apex predators who'd remembered their place in the food chain. They moved as a unit through the pre-match ceremonies, 5 individuals functioning as a single, perfectly coordinated organism. Their opponents in the finals were the Nexari Dominants, a species that had dominated team combat for the better part of a decade. Unlike the individual excellence of the Cocksmith, the Nexari fought as a hive mind, their consciousness literally linked during combat. They moved with supernatural coordination, anticipated each other's actions perfectly, and had never lost a team match in recorded history. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of all classifications, the arena announcer's voice boomed across the packed stadium. Welcome to the championship, finals of the Galactic Youth Combat Championships. The roar that followed was less sound than physical force, washing over the arena in waves that made the reinforced walls vibrate. In the coaching area, Danny felt the familiar pre-fight butterflies that had never really left him, no matter how many matches he'd been involved in over the years. The Nexari Dominants entered their preparation area in perfect synchronization, their crystalline forms refracting the arena lights into prismatic displays. They communicated in harmonics that sounded like wind chimes in a hurricane, their shared consciousness allowing for tactical coordination that bordered on telepathy. They move like they share the same nervous system, Lyra observed, her analytical mind already working on the puzzle they presented. Individual tactics won't work against opponents who think as one. Good thing we're not individuals anymore either, Ket replied, his voice carrying the kind of steady authority that made others want to follow him into whatever chaos awaited. Danny watched his cubs with the pride of someone who'd witnessed a miracle unfold in real time. These weren't the mechanical fighters he'd inherited. These were natural-born hunters who'd rediscovered their instincts and learned to trust them completely. "All right, team," Danny said, gathering them in their traditional pre-match huddle. "You know what you're capable of. You've proven it to yourselves, to me, and to that crowd out there. The only question now is, do you want to be champions?" The response wasn't verbal. It was a sound that started deep in Nox's chest, picked up by Ket's throat, harmonized by Zara's purring growl, analyzed and amplified by Lyra's tactical mind, and turned into pure, primal music by Bane's chaotic energy. It was the sound of a pack that had found its voice. It was the sound of champions who were done being anything less than what they were born to be. The team phase began with both squads entering the expanded combat area simultaneously, a multi-level arena designed to test every aspect of coordinated fighting. The Nexari moved like liquid mercury, flowing across obstacles with perfect unity. Their formation shifted constantly but never broke, each member anticipating the other's movements with impossible precision. For the first 30 seconds, it looked like the Cubs might be outmatched after all. The Nexari's coordination was flawless, their tactics seemingly designed by some cosmic intelligence that could see every possible outcome simultaneously. Then Danny started cheering. Not instructions, not tactical advice, just pure, unadulterated enthusiasm for what his fighters were accomplishing. His voice cut through the arena noise like a laser through fog, reaching each cub with the kind of emotional support they'd never experienced in competition. "That's it, Zara! Flow with them. Ket, lead them where you want them to go. Nox, be the mountain they have to go around. Lyra, see the pattern. Bane, break their rhythm." The transformation was immediate and devastating. The Cubs shifted from trying to match their opponent's coordination to imposing their own. Ket's leadership turned their pack from 5 individuals into a single hunting unit. Zara's fluid movement became the current that carried them forward. Nox's strength became the anchor that held their formation stable. Lyra's analysis found the microscopic gaps in the Nexari's perfect coordination. And Bane became the chaos that turned order into opportunity. The crowd watched in stunned silence as the Velnari Cubs began systematically dismantling opponents who'd seemed unbeatable moments before. But this wasn't just superior tactics or better conditioning. This was something deeper, more fundamental. The Nexari fought as a hive mind, but they thought as a hive mind too. Their perfection was also their limitation. They could only conceive of solutions that fit within their collective consciousness. The Cubs fought as individuals who chose to hunt together. Their coordination came from trust, communication, and mutual respect, rather than shared consciousness. When the situation demanded adaptation, they could shift tactics instantly. When innovation was needed, any one of them could contribute new ideas. Most importantly, they fought with passion. Not the cold efficiency of a hive mind, but the burning intensity of beings who desperately wanted to succeed for themselves and for each other. "Look at them move," Danny's voice carried across the arena, pride and amazement mixing in equal measure. "That's what champions look like." The final sequence unfolded like a perfectly choreographed dance of destruction. Ket led a coordinated assault that drew the Nexari into what appeared to be a tactical trap. Lyra's analysis had identified a weakness in their formation that only appeared when they committed to aggressive offense. Zara and Bane flanked wide, using Nox as mobile cover, while the big cub positioned himself to cut off retreat routes. The Nexari, locked into their perfect coordination, couldn't adapt fast enough to the cub's fluid tactics. Their hive mind had calculated the optimal response to every conventional strategy. But the cubs weren't fighting conventionally. They were fighting like Velnari, with all the creativity and passion that entailed. When the arena's victory signals finally sounded, the silence that followed lasted exactly long enough for the truth to sink in. The Velnari Cubs, the same team that had lost to geriatric philosophers and gelatinous blob creatures, had just defeated the RVV, most dominant team in tournament history. Then the explosion of sound that followed made every previous crowd reaction seem like a whispered conversation. Beings who'd never heard of the Velnari were on their feet, cheering for underdogs who'd become champions through sheer force of rediscovered will. In the aftermath, as trophy presentations and ceremony preparations swirled around them, Danny found himself in a quiet moment with his cubs. They looked different now, not just confident, but complete. They'd found something that had been trained out of them and made it their own again. "Coach Danny," Ket said, his voice carrying the kind of respect that couldn't be manufactured or demanded, "we need to ask you something." "Shoot, kid. Why did you believe in us when nobody else would?" Danny looked at these 5 young beings who'd taught him as much as he'd taught them, and realized the answer was simpler than he'd expected. "Because you're champions," he said. "You always were. You just needed someone to remind you that being a champion isn't about being perfect. It's about caring enough to try." The victory celebration that followed would be remembered long after the specific scores were forgotten. The Cubs didn't just accept their championship trophy, they claimed it, owned it, celebrated it, with the kind of joy that reminded everyone watching why sports mattered in the first place. But the real victory wasn't the trophy or the title, or even the redemption of an entire species' competitive reputation. The real victory was 5 young beings who'd learned that wanting something, fighting for it, and supporting each other through the struggle wasn't weakness. It was the source of all real strength. And one human coach who'd learned that sometimes the best thing you can do for natural-born champions is simply cheer loud enough for them to remember what they're capable of achieving. The galaxy had witnessed something unprecedented: the power of genuine encouragement to transcend species, culture, and expectation. The Cubs had refused to fight until their human cheered. Then they became unstoppable champions,